History as it happens, August 22nd, 2024. Bombs away, Nixon's lawless legacy.
Look at that. The bombing of Cambodia led to the eventual end of the longest war in this country's history.
But only history will discover why the greatest deception and possibly the most impeachable offense of Richard Nixon may not become a charge against him.
Today we'll examine why the President of the United States felt compelled to send forces into Cambodia.
American policy since then has been to scrupulously respect the neutrality of the Cambodian people.
American troops in Vietnam have been fighting bitterly for 9 days to take a position known as Hamburger Hill. Today, the 10th day, with 39 Americans dead and 273 injured, they took it.
The point is that, as we know, we couldn't do it with anything for B-52s because, goddammit, there's nothing else that can fly at this time of year.
And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace.
This month marked 50 years since Richard Nixon resigned the presidency for the crimes of Watergate. The endless fascination with the break-in and the cover-up has obscured what may be more important in Nixon's legacy: his contribution to the imperial presidency, crimes he got away with, a hubristic foreign policy that's defined the national security state ever since. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
And what's interesting is that at that point, not only Melvin Laird, Secretary of Defense, but even, Secretary of the Air Force and so forth, they're all saying don't do it. They're all saying that. And they're saying that because if American planes are flying over North Vietnam, a lot of planes are going to get shot down, that the North Vietnamese have improved their anti-aircraft capability. And so inevitably, as you're flying over Hanoi or wherever, planes are going to go down, pilots are going to be killed, pilots are going to be jailed, and so forth. And they don't care.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
August 8th, 1974. Nixon calls it quits.
President Nixon reportedly will announce his resignation tonight, and Vice President Ford will become the nation's 38th president tomorrow.
The Watergate scandal produced some of the most memorable moments in political history, even pop culture. I mean, how many times have you heard this?
That in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
We're not going to rehash Watergate for the umpteenth time. We're going to focus on something more relevant, more pressing. Nixon's foreign policy. Really, it's American foreign policy. Because Congress had a chance to hold the chief executive accountable for the crime of concealing the bombing of a neutral country during the Vietnam War. That was Cambodia. July 1974, the House Judiciary Committee opens impeachment hearings in the Watergate scandal. But as historian Carolyn Eisenberg writes in Fire and Rain, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Wars in Southeast Asia, 2 articles of impeachment were cast into oblivion by the committee. One was Article 4. Introduced by Representative John Conyers of Michigan, it charged the president with the submission to the Congress of false and misleading statements concerning the existence, scope, and nature of American bombing operations in Cambodia in derogation of the power of the Congress to declare war, to make appropriations, and to raise and support armies. Eisenberg goes on to say, unlike the other charges the Judiciary Committee had considered, the veracity of the Cambodia charge was not disputed. Whatever the motive, the Nixon administration had clearly deceived Congress with the intent to sidestep its prerogative to declare war and appropriate funds for that purpose. Conyers wanted the committee to reaffirm that legislative responsibility. He said many people don't know or have forgotten that the Congress constitutionally has that sole authority. And so I would urge that we, in an attempt to reassert those powers which we consider vital and precious, if the constitutional form of government is to prevail and continue and improve, that we give the gravest consideration to this article. Carolyn Eisenberg's book won a prestigious Bancroft Prize this year for historical scholarship. She takes us into the Nixon White House, the jungles of Southeast Asia, and to the peace table in Paris. She shows how an American president and his national security advisor prolonged the war, misled the public, and caused appalling carnage in faraway places, and got away with it. And that has had terrible consequences for our own time. Remember, Article 4 in 1974 was voted down. So, do you remember Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense in the 1990s, William Cohen? In 74, he was Maine Congressman William Cohen, and on the Judiciary Committee, he explained why he didn't think the secret bombing of Cambodia was an impeachable offense.
We've had more than 50 allegations leveled against the president, and upon examination, investigation, reflection on my part, I found many of them to be simply without any factual support. Others have been very serious, and they've been mentioned before. The secret bombing of Cambodia, the impoundment of funds appropriated by Congress, the expenditure of tax dollars for the personal benefit of the president's home in California. But in each of these cases and areas, after giving full consideration to all the factors involved, I concluded they would not support the president's removal.
And Republican Thomas Railsback of Illinois had this to say.
I don't think that this president should be held to account for a bombing in Cambodia when those of you who have read The Best and the Brightest, the book by David Halberstam, have read probably the greatest indictment of the two previous administrations about untruths, distortions, statistics that were not accurate.
But Massachusetts Democrat Robert Drinan, who is a clergyman, said the Cambodia issue may have been the most important one for the impeachers to consider.
My concern over this question has deepened as I have witnessed the process of selecting articles of impeachment on the basis of whether they will fly. I have been deeply troubled because the process of choosing articles of impeachment is not necessarily done in the order of their gravity, but to some extent on their capacity to play in Peoria. There has been no shortage of lawless acts on which to focus in this inquiry, but only history will discover why the greatest deception and possibly the most impeachable offense of Richard Nixon may not become a charge against him.
So a couple months ago, Yale's Ona Hathaway wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs that I thought of while I was reading Eisenberg's study. The essay was published after the Supreme Court ruled presidents enjoy immunity from criminal prosecution. Wrote Hathaway, what most analysts have failed to note is that this lack of legal accountability for decisions by the U.S. president, including decisions to direct the military to use lethal force, is nothing new. It has long been the reality for most of the world outside the United States. For decades, she writes, American presidents have waged illegal wars, plotted to assassinate foreign leaders, unlawfully detained and tortured people, toppled democratic governments, and supported repressive regimes without any possibility of legal accountability in either domestic or international courts. Although people all over the world have suffered from these unlawful acts, says Hathaway, Americans have lived in a bubble. So the Nixon and Kissinger who appear on the pages of Fire and Rain lived in an information bubble too, of their own creation. They were obsessed with how their actions, how the war was being portrayed in the press. In their private phone calls and conversations, there's not a word of remorse or pity for the people dying under the rain of bombs falling from American B-52s. Just listen to this typical exchange from December of 1971.
We're going to be awful hard to negotiate with, though, at this point. There's no reason to just go through that business of Paris again.
I think, Mr. President, that as we discussed a few weeks ago, towards the end of January, you might not go public with the October plan and put it before them as if it were a new plan.
Yeah.
Say a little bit about what's gone before. I wouldn't give a long story.
Nope, I agree.
I don't think people are really interested in a...
No, they aren't interested in who did what to whom. They're only interested in, well, you remember, now is the time to have the benefit of what we did in October of 70. Just put out a new peace plan, and then it'll get a big play, and then they'll not answer it, and that's that.
That's right, but it'll get us a month or two.
That's right.
We can say a little bit about what went on during the summer testing.
Yeah, I would simply, without going into details, I would simply say that we have had 10 or 15 private meetings on this and that, and have presented this all to them, and this is our offer.
And it's a lie that they've been planned to the 7 points. We've actually been negotiating it.
Correct.
But this is what we now put before them grows out of a private and public meeting.
This strike will probably not be played then in the papers until tomorrow.
Well, not until, no, actually, but the papers the way they run, not until tomorrow, that's right.
Publicly, Nixon touted his Vietnamization plan: withdraw U.S. forces, allow the South Vietnamese to take on the bulk of the fighting. But even here, the illegal bombing of Cambodia went on for 14 months. And then in May of 1970, Nixon sent in U.S. ground forces into Cambodia, provoking intense anger and nationwide protests.
Mr. Risher.
Mr. President, have you been surprised by the intensity of the protest against your decision to send troops into Cambodia? And will these protests affect your policy in any way?
No, I have not been surprised by the intensity of the protest. I realize that those who are protesting believe that this decision will expand the war, increase American casualties, and increase American involvement. And those who protest want peace, they want to reduce American casualties, and they want our boys brought home. I made the decision, however, for the very reasons that they are protesting. And as far as affecting my decision is concerned, their protests I am concerned about. I am concerned because I know how deeply they feel. But I know that what I have done will accomplish the goals that they want. It will shorten this war. It will reduce American casualties. It will allow us to go forward with our withdrawal program. The 150,000 Americans that I announced for withdrawal in the next year will come home on schedule. And it will, in my opinion, serve the cause of a just peace.
By the end of 1972, Nixon really had no choice but to agree to the Paris Peace Accords, which gave the North Vietnamese what they wanted: an ongoing presence in the South and a unilateral American exit. But Nixon and Kissinger got something they wanted too: their decent interval. For more on the end of the war, or at least American involvement in that war, you can listen to the podcast episode titled A Decent Interval. I'll even include a link to it in my weekly newsletter. You can sign up at historyasithappens.com or find History As It Happens on Substack. Today we're going to discuss Fire and Rain, the imperial presidency, and lessons not learned from the past. Carolyn Eisenberg, welcome back to the podcast.
Happy to be here.
And congratulations on your winning the Bancroft Prize for Fire and Rain. Last time we spoke, the 50th anniversary of the Paris Non-Peace Accords, January 73. How long did it take you to write this book?
I lie about it, so anything I say isn't really worth it. But I would put it in the ballpark of 20 years. Well, with the caveat, it really sounds like, oh my goodness, this person just stayed in her computer for 20 years. I was working full time. So, but the other thing that's interesting about the 20 years is that part of why that happened was the declassification that went on. I mean, it's just been incredible. I didn't really anticipate anywhere, the volume of what, or the character of what became available. So, for example, when I started out, one of the things I was interested in was their diplomacy with Soviet Union and China. And, there was a lot of material about that, but I didn't really anticipate the transcripts of those meetings were going to ever see the light of day. But they did. So just one illustration. So a lot more information became available, and it just seemed crazy to not pay attention to it as it was coming. So that's the other reason why it actually took a long time.
Well, Sergei Radchenko just wrote a book about Soviet foreign policy where he was able to access archival documents that at one point he probably thought would never see the light of day either, but they were opened up by Putin, of all people, for the Soviet past.
No, I'm actually interested in that book. You gave it you made a convincing case. People should read it.
I say the same about Fire and Rain. It is an essential book. We're going to get into why it is so relevant, the imperial presidency, as it is called, and maybe the more important aspect of Nixon's legacy as it pertains to Watergate, or maybe the one we spend less time discussing. I think we don't need yet another rehashing of the break-in and the cover-up. But
we don't.
But first, where were you, Carolyn Eisenberg, in the summer of 68?
It depends what part of the summer. In the early summer of 68, I was in court because ironically, the people who had been arrested at Columbia, which included me and about 800 other people, we had to be in court the day, and it turned out that night Bobby Kennedy was killed.
That's June 4th.
We had to be in court that morning. I mean, this had been scheduled, in advance. And so, it was very surreal because I just remember long lines of arrested students that were outside the court.
Well, what were you arrested for? Anti-war protesting, but what exactly?
And also, issues about the university's treatment of Harlem. The charge wasn't very serious. An offense I never knew existed, criminal trespass, which actually I think a lot of the protesters right now at these campuses, a number of them have been charged with that. Anyway, so our day in court, we were supposed to come in and everything was very surreal, right? And Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. It was maybe 1 a.m. And, we all were aware that this had happened. And when we went into the court, the judge was furious, but he blamed us for the assassination because his point was, that because of people like us, the 800, this created an atmosphere in which Bobby Kennedy was killed. It's why I wasn't in Chicago, because both my husband and I were arrested and we didn't necessarily want to get arrested again. So we were really, like a lot of other people, glued to our television. And of course, we had many friends that were in Chicago. So especially when you saw the police go crazy.
Most delegates to this convention do not know that thousands of young people are being beaten in the streets of Chicago.
Tear gas has been used as the demonstrators are attempting to form a line of parade.
The deep sadness that we feel over the troubles and the violence which have erupted regrettably and tragically in the streets of this great city.
It was very worrisome.
Yeah, it was a police riot.
I actually had been a student at the University of Chicago, so the whole question of the Chicago police, they were somewhat notorious for being very harsh on demonstrators. So this wasn't just like some unusual thing that happened.
The reason I ask is because when you were talking about how long you've been working on this book, this is really your life's work. You were an anti-war activist during Vietnam, then you became a scholar, and you are noted for your scholarship about international affairs and conflict. So all of these comparisons now between the summer of '68 and Chicago 2024, as we speak here, as we record this conversation, the DNC is underway, but I don't really see too many parallels here. There were 500,000 Americans fighting in Vietnam in 1968. That is why LBJ dropped out of the race. Biden's policy in Gaza is very unpopular, but with a relatively small part of the electorate. So I guess I'm straining to see the parallels, other than the superficial one that we had a change at the top of the ticket.
Well, actually, if I could just go back for one minute to pre-summer, because actually the other thing that I was doing, my husband and I were in Wisconsin. We were campaigning for Eugene McCarthy in March of '68.
He almost won the New Hampshire primary.
So Wisconsin, this was direct Gene McCarthy and Lyndon Johnson on the ballot. It felt like there were a million students there in Wisconsin, which is an exaggeration, but there were a ton of students working in that primary. And it was pretty clear from the going door to door that he was going to lose terribly, which, we have a lot of evidence that his staff were telling him he was going to lose, and it was going to be a big embarrassment. And so he withdrew from the race 2 nights before the vote in Wisconsin.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
I would just sort of mention in passing on that, a lot of times when writers talk about 1968, they draw this very sharp distinction between the good kids, who went on a political track, and then the troublemakers. But, that's a little bit untrue. Like, people did a lot of different things. People went back and forth. I think the overriding feeling was to try to get the policy changed. So what method you used at any given moment, would really vary. But let me go back to your question about, what's the same and what's not the same. I think what is the same is that you have a foreign policy issue which feels like a profoundly moral issue. It's not like one of, oh, well, there's, there's agriculture, there's inflation, there's immigration, there's this, that, and the other thing. Oh, and then there's also Gaza. Let's move right on, which is actually what happened last night. It was like Gaza was, on a laundry list of things that people were talking about. But there are millions of people around the country for whom this isn't a laundry list. They have relatives there, whether in the West Bank or in Gaza itself. And as, we saw in the spring, for a lot of young people who tuned in on this maybe hadn't paid that much attention. The idea that you're killing people with American weapons and that our taxpayers are paying for that. I mean, how many children have died in Gaza? It's like maybe 10,000. And in that way, it is like Vietnam because it would, for a certain sector of the population, this is an overriding moral issue. And frankly, the American policy is incomprehensible to normal people. Like, why are we doing this? And it isn't clear that that's a popular, for I think lots of Americans think giving weapons to Netanyahu is actually not a very good idea. But lots of people, it's not a big deal for them. It's a little thing that they think. But you have millions of people that's not true. And, the immediate tangible thing last night for the position of the Democrats was they wanted to just avoid disruption, right? That was the lesson of Chicago. It damaged Humphrey when it happened. They were very concerned to make sure that whatever went on, there wouldn't be trouble.
So I tend to agree. I'm personally disgusted and enraged by U.S. support for Israel in this war. Some 40,000 Palestinians killed, as you said, with U.S. weapons, and that is what has triggered these protests. I guess what I'm getting at is the difference is I don't know if Gaza will be decisive in the outcome of this election, whereas we all know Vietnam was the most important, among other issues, but the most important issue in 1968.
Well, we don't know that. And part of what makes this kind of chaotic is all these polls that, change every 5 minutes. But I think it is potentially decisive, actually. And again, one point that is, been made numerous times now is it could really hurt Biden in Michigan.
Or now Harris in Michigan.
Did I just, right? Yeah, I haven't mentally adjusted yet.
Well, she does own the policy until she creates some distance between herself.
She's looking for a million ways to make herself sound different without getting near the core of the issue, which is, are we sending arms to Netanyahu or are we not? Are we protecting Israel in the United Nations or are we not? She's looking to find a way to be sympathetic to the Palestinians without touching, those things. And in any case, I think the danger in terms of the election is that, in various places, even in Brooklyn, she's going to win in Brooklyn. But there's a lot of people in the Muslim community for whom this is issue number one, and a lot of non-Muslims for whom it's issue number one. So, that can make a critical difference in some of these swing states where it's very close. I think the other thing is that the student situation is volatile. I think there's going to be a lot of trouble in the fall with people coming back to school. That I would be very surprised if that didn't happen, because the administrations around the country have been so high-handed in their dealing with students who are protesting in the spring. Stories are legion about that. And of course, if the situation in Gaza isn't better, you're going to have around the country a lot of students that are going to make trouble.
On that parallel, an important difference possibly between then and now. And in your book, you do a marvelous job describing the contours of the anti-war movement, its depth, its diversity, how it went mainstream and, let's just say, respectable, right? Because a lot of people may agree that the war is wrong, but they don't necessarily approve of the way anti-war activists behave or some of their messaging. We saw that in just the past few months, right? So today, how would you compare the way anti-war activists are behaving, if you will, versus in your day in the 1960s, where ordinary people joined the moratorium and there were thousands of somber and poignant, thousands of small demonstrations all over the country to signal disapproval of the war, silent vigils that were so effective. Whereas today, a lot of people see this stuff on social media. They see pro-Palestinian protesters defacing public property, waving Hamas flags. There was some of this in the 1960s, of course, people romanticizing romanticizing Ho Chi Minh. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I did think when I was researching this was about the diversity and also the impact of the anti-war movement. I mean, one of the themes in my book, which in some ways I could have made even more explicit, is the extent to which the anti-war movement even affected policy. Through the Nixon years, that first term, anyone I knew didn't think we were affecting anything. I mean, that was the overriding sense, whether you big marches, little marches, parades, whatever it is, we weren't making a big difference. And I think one of the things that's surprised me and has influenced my thinking in the present is that the anti-war movement really did make a difference. Also, that the anti-war movement was diverse in ways that really were not appreciated. So, I mean, one piece of my book, which is about Cambodia, for example, the killing of Kent State students is iconic. But, for millions of Americans, the picture of those protesters was, this is again, these privileged upper middle class kids who taking advantage of things, making trouble, et cetera. And so one of the things that really interested me was when I looked at Kent State, which I planned to only do for about 5 minutes, it was really interesting. That event in many ways was an event of working class kids.
They've got grievances, they've got demands. The demands on both sides. We have to talk.
Leave this area immediately.
And all of a sudden I heard the shooting.
I did an interview with a couple of the participants, particularly Ron Camphora, who was the kid carrying the black flag. When I interviewed him, I said, by the way, why did you have that flag? Why were you running across the field with the black flag? And so what he told me, which really opened my eyes in a lot of ways, is that he was, as a student, was living off campus in an apartment. The people he was living with, some of them were vets. But in addition, one of his roommates' brother had been killed 2 weeks before or 3 weeks before in Vietnam. And he was killed in a stupid way, which is that a tank rolled back over him. What Ron told me is that they all went, he and this group of friends, some of, again, who were vets, went to the funeral or the memorial for his brother. That when they left that memorial, that they all said to each other, we have got to do something to end this. And the question was, what would they do? And so Ron told me he was carrying that flag because in honor of this brother. This isn't what the media was conveying about who these people were. The polarization that the media present isn't really true. These are kids from Ohio who are working class, first people in their family to go to college. That interview made me think a lot more and get a lot more careful about who were the people at Kent State.
Yeah, they just weren't a bunch of hippies or bums, as Nixon called them bums. There were plenty of pro-war. There were people who did not want the United States to pull out of Vietnam, who opposed the anti-war protesters. Calling them pro-war maybe is not accurate, but you know what I mean. There was that protest or demonstration by hard hats in Manhattan. Construction workers went on a rampage and beat up the hippies, right? Or, these privileged kids at Ivy League schools who didn't have to worry about being drafted, etc. But there was much more to it than that, despite what Nixon and some of these others said.
Right. There was a polarization. There were those rioters down in Lower Manhattan. I mean, that happened. It wasn't made up. My bigger point really is how diverse the anti-war movement became. And I think that was pretty late. One thing I would really sort of emphasize that I learned, really, I think it's only in 1968 that the anti-war movement begins to have an effect on policy. Before that, there people are marching around, nothing's happening. But the first effect, of course, was that it did get Lyndon Johnson to institute a partial bombing halt, not a complete one, but partial. But the biggest impact was on Nixon. The thing that I try to highlight in my book and really stayed with me is that the biggest success of the anti-war movement, which nobody I knew thought was a success, is that Nixon took the troops out. From the summer of 1969 on, he's taking troops out.
We have adopted a plan, which we have worked out in cooperation with the South Vietnamese, for the complete withdrawal of all U.S. combat ground forces and their replacement by South Vietnamese forces.
And by the time the election takes place in November, there are no combat troops left in Vietnam. There's maybe 25,000 troops left, most of them not combat troops. That was a very big change in American policy, and it had very significant implications for the Vietnamese as well. And again, if you're in the anti-war movement, you just, every time Nixon would go on the air and say, I'm taking 20,000 troops, I'm taking 50,000, everybody I know would say, oh, this is another one of his tricks, because he's really expanding the war and he's just tricking the public. And I don't know if we talked about this in a previous podcast or not, but in 1972, close to the election, there was a poll of Americans, who do you trust more to end the war in Vietnam, George McGovern or Richard Nixon? And, most people said Richard Nixon. If you were in the anti-war movement, you'd say, oh my God, that just shows how people don't really understand what's going on.
One point you make in your book is right throughout all these years, even as Nixon was escalating the war into Cambodia and Laos, of course, some of that was not very well covered or known at the time, he was withdrawing troops tens of thousands at a time, even though Kissinger did not want that. Nixon was the decider. And public opinion polls, and we look back at Nixon today, oh, how unpopular, what an SOB. But public opinion polls at the time showed support for what Nixon was doing. People trusted him, even as he was, to some degree, deceiving them about what was going on over there.
Young people were coming home. Soldiers were coming back from Vietnam. I mean, that was really big. Right? So you're in a little town in Ohio, and as of, let's say, 1968, a lot of young boys have been drafted because they didn't have money to go to college. So you have a lot of kids over there. And now Richard Nixon's, the ones that are alive, Richard Nixon is bringing them home. He had done that by November of 1972, which meant that his options going forward were severely, he had to really make peace with North Vietnam. And I kept saying, well, why didn't we appreciate that back then? That's a big part of it, as well as that I think the electoral politics and the situation with Congress, that all these things had more of an impact than we saw at the time.
Let's return to that, because I do want to talk about what Nixon was saying about peace with honor and some other related issues, the decent interval, escalating the war into Cambodia. Let's return to all of that, because as you say, why didn't we appreciate it more at the time? Well, there were good reasons for that. It wasn't that he was only withdrawing troops from Vietnam. He was doing other things at the same time in surrounding countries. One more question about 1968, and this is a question that pertains to Kamala Harris today and Joe Biden's policy in Gaza. I saw a quote just yesterday, Hubert Humphrey saying, I wish I hadn't allowed a man, LBJ, who was leaving office, was going to be out of power, to so control my message and my own campaign as I was running for president in 1968. In other words, Humphrey regretted not separating himself from the administration war policy sooner. Why didn't he?
I mean, it's a very good question, Martin. But, one thing that has to be put in, this is actually a difference with Kamala Harris, is that prior to becoming the candidate, unexpectedly, Hubert Humphrey was going around the country, defending Johnson's policy.
What I think is most important is that whatever we do, that we keep in mind that we have forces there in South Vietnam. The American people are not going to stand for any kind of a peace arrangement or any kind of a tactical arrangement relating to the peace discussion that leaves our men in South Vietnam at the mercy of the enemy. They're just not going to do that, and you shouldn't expect them to do that. So whatever we do in terms of trying to move the negotiations forward, which I want to have happen very much, must call for some kind of restraint and response, reasonable response from Hanoi.
I can remember him coming to the National Student Association, for example, in Wisconsin in 1966, I think, trying to make the case for why Johnson's policy was the right one. So he's not a candidate at that point. So one of his problems is that he's really linked to the policy. I don't think Kamala Harris is linked to Gaza in the way that Humphrey was. So there's that. He was constantly worried that Johnson was going to undermine him. And he never felt relaxed about that. And so one of the big inhibitors for him was, if he became a critic, in what way could Johnson turn against him? And so that hung over him in a way that, for example, Joe Biden is not going to hang over Kamala Harris. Now, as you know, in the end, he did change finally, and after a lot of bad polls. And so I think it was the 30th of September or maybe the 1st of October.
He gave a speech.
He finally goes so far as to say there should be a complete bombing halt, rather than the partial one that Johnson had set. So that was a big deal for Humphrey to say it. But it wasn't a big deal for most people.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were opposed to the war and the bombing and everything else, this last minute thing about, okay, well, we should stop the bombing. It's too late. It's too little.
And Johnson wasn't doing a great job of keeping Humphrey up to date on what was happening with the secret negotiations that would result in a bombing halt that Johnson announced on Halloween, October 31st, a week before the election. I just had Ken Hughes in for a rather long conversation about the Chenault affair and the impact of that. We don't need to go in depth on that because we'll never get around to discussing the gist of your book. But briefly, do you agree with Ken that the Chenault affair had a real impact on the outcome of the election? I mean, Nixon seems to have thought that it was the key to put him over the top because Humphrey had caught up to him in the polls.
Well, I do agree with Ken about that, although I agree in terms of the election, but not necessarily long term. In other words, finally, I guess right at the end of October, beginning of November, the U.S. negotiator had gotten to a place with the North Vietnamese where there was going to be a total bombing halt and the peace talks were going to really start, official peace talks. So that happened. Nixon was very unhappy about that because that could turn the election. And their polling was very close at that point. Nixon had his people basically telling the South Vietnamese that if they refused to cooperate right then, that Nixon would get them a better deal later. So that's treason. Here was Johnson announcing that peace talks were going forward, which could have put Humphrey over the top at that point. But then you have the South Vietnamese government saying, no, we're not going to participate. So it was very damaging. But I do think there's some other piece of it, which is that it was meaningful that they finally got, they were set to get the real negotiations going. But they were very far apart on a peace agreement. Henry Kissinger, when he comes in as National Security Advisor, he actually thinks he's going to be able to get a deal with the North Vietnamese. But the two sides were really very far apart. Even when real negotiations started, they were very far apart. And just as one illustration of that, there's many, but the simplest one is it was the U.S. position that, there should be mutual troop withdrawal, that we would take our troops out and they would take their troops out, and that's what would happen. There's not a chance in hell they were going to do that because they didn't think that they were equivalent, right? The U.S. is the U.S. Why are you even in our country?
You mean when they wouldn't do that? You're talking to the North Vietnamese about that.
Right. I'm saying that this is comes as a bolt from the blue for Henry Kissinger, right? They think that they're going to convince the North Vietnamese for mutual troop withdrawal. That belief was completely mistaken. The North Vietnamese were so far away from making any kind of agreement like that. Ken Hughes is right. It would have helped Hubert Humphrey in those last weeks leading up to the election if Nixon hadn't gummed up the works. It might really have made a difference. But in terms of the war itself, the two sides were still very far apart.
And there was also the issue of the makeup of the South Vietnamese government going forward. So
Right.
Nixon and Kissinger were intractable on these key points. To our earlier discussion about Nixon and the troop withdrawals, why wasn't this better appreciated at the time? It was because of the other things they were doing at the peace table, for instance. And then, of course, escalating the violence, the air war, the invasion of Cambodia. It was sending mixed signals to the population. If we're leaving, then why are you doing these other things to prolong this war on the faulty claim that the South Vietnamese government is going to survive when they knew, of course, that it wouldn't? That becomes the decent interval. I basically just wrapped up the conversation on my own and answered my own question there, Carolyn.
Can I sneak in on the decent interval? I just want to say, one thing about this. Many historians, probably beginning with an excellent historian, Jeffrey Kimball, they knew that the South Vietnamese government couldn't last, and what they were hoping for was a decent interval between our withdrawal and the other side winning.
So we've got to find some formula They hold the thing together a year or two. Afterwards, after a year, Mr. President, Vietnam will be a backwater. If we settle, let's say, this October, by January 74, no one will give a damn.
I actually think that that's a more mixed thing than people say, because what it discounts, first of all, is that high-level people, in this case, Nixon and Kissinger, changed their mind, and they engaged in a lot of wishful thinking. And that's really important, this wishful thinking, that things are going to work out for the best because they're doing it.
Drop some more bombs, and that'll change the North Vietnamese
mind. They actually go back and forth, and maybe they're also different from each other. Yeah. And maybe they also change over time. So I think what's probably accurate here is that Kissinger, more than Nixon, had a lot of contempt for the South Vietnamese government. And he was more skeptical privately about their ability to survive. So the decent interval a little bit more pertains to him. I don't think we should discount how wishful thinking enters in. Not just for those two people, but, going forward, with American policy in the war, how much people in power make up things or pretend to themselves that their decisions are good ones.
But they certainly didn't want the whole thing to fall apart before the election in 72.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll get back to that. So Ona Hathaway, who is an international law professor at Yale, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs a couple of weeks back after the Supreme Court handed down their ruling in Trump versus United States, which gave for the first time in American history the presidency immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts, whatever that might be. Whatever that might be. So Hathaway wrote, what most analysts have failed to note is that this lack of legal accountability for decisions by the U.S. president, including decisions to direct the military to use lethal force, is nothing new. It has long been the reality for most of the world outside the United States. For decades, she writes, American presidents have waged illegal wars, plotted to assassinate foreign leaders, unlawfully detained and tortured people, toppled democratic governments, and supported repressive regimes without any possibility of legal accountability in either domestic or international courts. So August came around, and it was the 50th anniversary of Nixon's resignation. I read this piece by Ona Hathaway, and then I began reading your book in advance of our conversation today. And it all came together so perfectly as I was reading your introduction about the articles of impeachment against Nixon, the House Judiciary Committee, and Congressman John Conyers of Michigan, who wanted there to be an article of impeachment about the bombing of Cambodia, which had gone on in secret, quote-unquote secret, wasn't secret to the people who were being killed, for 14 months prior to the land invasion of Cambodia. Why did Conyers insist on having this article of impeachment in the case against Nixon, and why didn't it get enough votes?
I want to just put in here that it was Conyers that took the lead on that, but Elizabeth Holtzman, who was perhaps the youngest congresswoman or congressperson at that time, was working closely with him. So she was very involved in that effort. And, it was basically being stifled by Peter Rodino, who was running the whole operation, the whole hearing. In many different ways, Peter Rodino used his power to make it very difficult for them to move forward on that. But I think the other piece is that they didn't have a majority. I mean, look, the substantive issue is basically they're saying, not just about Cambodia, we need to have a public recognition of the damage that is being done internationally by the Nixon administration. We need to make that public. We need to address that fact. And it has long-term implications if we fail. The argument on the other side was, and this included fellow Democrats, was we want our impeachment effort to be bipartisan. And passing this article of impeachment is going to create more division right now. We're in good shape. We're ready to go on domestic. So why are we going to have a big fight about this? And again, you have people like Father Drinan coming in and saying, we need to have this fight because it means acknowledging, this terrible policy and the harm that it did.
I am profoundly disturbed at the massive cover-up of the facts during and after the secret bombing raids, where 3,695 B-52s went over Cambodia during a period of 14 months from March 69 to May 1970. I remember well my absolute consternation on July 16, 1973, when the Cambodian bombings were revealed for the first time. I learned on that day that President Nixon had misled me and misled the entire nation when he had said 3 years prior to that time, on April 30, 1970, that, quote, "For the past 5 years, we have provided no military assistance whatever and no economic assistance to Cambodia," unquote. The calculated cover-up of Cambodia, like the cover-up of Watergate, unraveled by accident. We heard of it in the Congress and in the country because a foreign correspondent happened to report on his discovery in Cambodia of the thousands of craters made by American B-52s.
It's a war crime.
It's a war crime.
Yeah, I mean, Lyndon Johnson had been bombing Laos, which, I wasn't really aware of how much damage the United States did to that country. I've read some about Cambodia until reading your book. We'll get into all of this, time permitting here. But yeah, the article of impeachment doesn't get enough votes, and I think that has had a lasting negative consequence for our country.
In terms of the larger issue, because I read the article that you're talking about, and I was sort of thinking about. So unlike you, I watched all of the convention last night.
I skipped it, but yeah, go ahead.
I was very struck that Joe Biden articulates this idea of America as like this ideal around the world. Everyone respects us. We're the law and order people, blah, blah, blah. And, with thunderous applause from the delegates. And when I was watching that, and of course I was thinking about Gaza and arming Netanyahu. But, one of the things that I think is really important is that the people in our country as a whole have never come to terms with anything that we have done abroad. There is no awareness whatsoever.
It's a bipartisan thing, too, but go ahead.
It's really overwhelming. I teach American foreign policy. And as a professor, I'm not trying to persuade students of a particular point of view, but I want them to learn about things that they have never learned about, right? I mean, about what the U.S. has done, with interfering with elections, assassinating leaders, the whole fakery surrounding the war in Iraq, the killing of civilians. There's this history of decades and decades of really criminal actions on the part of the U.S. government. And my students never heard about any of it. And I'm looking at that convention last night, cheering Joe Biden, saying those simple, oh, us, we're the best, we're number one. And the impeachment issue is symbolic, right? That it is true that most students, if you ask them about Richard Nixon, they tell you about Watergate. They have no idea that maybe 2 or 3 million people died because of his foreign policy. I think in a way it's symbolic of a much broader problem, which is that our people live in almost total ignorance of what our government does abroad, and we never take account or responsibility for anything.
Yeah, so the failure of this article of impeachment is just one piece of a larger issue. It's not the only reason why we are in this mess today of forever wars and sprawling security commitments, and neither party really wanting to face up to this problem. It's a bipartisan thing, and have a real discussion about limiting executive power in war making, or having Congress reassert its prerogatives. Question the fundamentals. Why do we have 1,000 bases all over the world? What did we get out of the global war on terror that was supposed to make us safe, that caused the deaths and destruction and immiseration of millions of people, caused migrants going into Europe, reordered the politics of the entire European continent? We're not having these discussions, really. No. I mean, you and I are having these discussions. Think tanks in Washington talk about these things, but it doesn't really enter the mainstream of an election season.
It doesn't enter the mainstream at any point. Yeah. And there's so many pieces of what was not addressed, which is Henry Kissinger. One of the consequences of saying we're not going to do anything about foreign policy, we're not going to have an article of impeachment about Cambodia, it took U.S. foreign policy off the table. And what it meant practically in terms of who were the recognized villains are Haldeman and Ehrlichman and so forth, those people. And, they were. But it left Henry Kissinger actually stronger than he had been in the first place, going into the next administration.
Yeah. The man who falsified records about the bombing of Cambodia to hide it from the public,
He comes out of the whole demise of the Nixon administration. He's even more respected, despite the fact that at least in some ultimate sense, he is the decider. He's the person that's pushing more than anybody, except maybe Al-Hay, for more military power to be used. Before he died, he had like a 100th birthday party. Nice. All the, important people came to honor him on his 100th birthday party. And the fact that that could even happen, the significance of that is the non-recognition of what this person did and what American foreign policy did.
Did he recognize it? I mean, I have some questions I wanted to ask you about some of the really important or trenchant observations in your book. One of them was Nixon and Kissinger, for all the acclaim about their intellects and knowledge about the world, didn't really know very much about Southeast Asia, didn't seem to be very interested in what was going on there. But they had to know what the bombing was doing in Laos and Cambodia, the B-52s. I mean, did they?
This is where historians can really be very challenged when you have thousands of records. They know and they don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's the feeling I got from reading your book when you went over all of Kissinger's phone calls, right?
I mean, the other thing which I was struggling with in my book and which I think is really important and relevant to what's happening now. It is really true that Nixon and Kissinger were really the deciders, and Nixon more than Kissinger. And in answer to your earlier question, they are so uninterested in the hurt that their policies create. They have no interest in it. And the kinds of reports that they read don't tell them, right? I mean, that's the other thing. So they're getting things that are prepared by McAfee, of how many dead people in this place or that place. But that shields them from the significance of what they're doing.
Laos was depopulated, right? Sorry to interrupt.
Or whole areas were. Again, Laos was a sort of story that we didn't pay very much attention to. And it was a policy that was in place under Johnson. It wasn't just Nixon. Bombing and the Plain of Jars, where thousands of people lived, and thousands of people were actually experiencing ongoing bombing in their area. They dug holes to protect themselves and would come out at night. Yeah. We had no idea really about Laos. I mean, it was very underplayed.
Now, you write here on page 126 of your book, the rhythms of life on the Plain of Jars were thus reversed, with people sleeping during the day and waiting until dark to obtain their food, empty the buckets they were using as toilets, and allow their children a chance to play. And they were in these slip trenches in zigzag patterns, as it's described here, for months at a time while the United States dropped bombs all over them.
There was a New York Times reporter who ended up meeting refugees from the Plain of Jars and told their stories. And it was a Times reporter there. And I went to look at the New York Times, and I couldn't find it. And I wrote to the reporter and I got back this email within about 5 minutes because I was curious. There was a particular reporter. He was hearing these stories. I'm not seeing it in the New York Times. So I just wanted to talk with him. I get this email back, and the subject line said they wouldn't print my stories.
So the reporter's still around.
Well, he was, when I was working on the book, he was. Okay. One other sort of myth from this period is, but what's implied is that the American press was determined to go after the policymakers and to bring bad news to the people and so forth. The truth is our mass media was pretty mixed. They did have reporters who went places and who wrote about things that they saw that were really awful. But how much priority that kind of reporting was going to get, not so straightforward at all. So, I mean, the media was kind of mixed. But what's interesting, and this goes back to your earlier question, is one way that Nixon and Kissinger could learn about what American policy was doing is they could read the newspaper, right? Because there were certainly stories that were, horrible enough. And, all you had to do was turn the page 1 of the New York Times. And what I think is really interesting about that is they refused to learn from that. In other words, their whole attitude is if a story comes out that is talking about some harm that is done to actual people, that story shows up. Their thinking is, oh my God, it's terrible. It's, that this is happening. No. Their thinking is that New York Times, they're always trying to get us. What are we going to do about this?
That's another thing that struck me from reading your book. They handled the war as a public relations
Absolutely.
problem.
and they couldn't learn. Daniel Ellsberg, before he became a notorious revealer of documents, was a government insider, and he had been a consultant to Henry Kissinger for some amount of time. Before that, he had been working for McNamara. So Daniel Ellsberg knew a lot about how things went. Part of what he said to Kissinger when Kissinger became National Security Advisor, Henry, now you're going to get all these top secret things and you're going to think you know more than anybody and everybody else is stupid. But be careful, because if those are the only things you read, you're never going to be able to learn anything. Ellsberg's phrase was, you're going to become a kind of moron because you can't learn and you can't hear.
That's a title of one of your chapters.
Right? It's a great line, right? You're going to become a kind of moron. And it really accurately captures what was happening at the top in terms of everything is public relations, as you're saying. Was this a bad article for us? Was not that's it. Like, was it good for us? It was bad for us. Not, my goodness, this is happening. This is terrible. We should change something. It's not just them, right?
The military thought they were still winning the war, could win.
It's these national security bureaucracies that are vast. So, on the one hand, you say, who are the deciders? Well, they're the deciders. But if you look at the larger context, these are two guys who are basically conformists, ironically enough. And when they come in, there's nobody in the national security bureaucracies who are saying to them, this is a loser, people are dying for nothing. And nobody's saying that. They're surrounded with people who just want to keep going because we haven't won yet. One of the challenges for me as an author is how do you deal with the fact that these two people who are deciding all this stuff, but they're not really acting alone. They have these vast bureaucracies that are directing them in a particular way.
And because they weren't very interested in what was actually happening in Southeast Asia, they would be swayed by information that was delivered to them by people who had an agenda like continuing the war, the military. So is it possible to identify a date when Nixon realizes, okay, we're not going to win, so we're going to get peace with honor, but we have to find a face-saving way out?
Almost. Almost. Part of the policy that they've been working with is the policy of Vietnamization, right? That's partly what they're saying is we're taking these troops out in increments and we're pouring resources into the army of South Vietnam, and they're going to take up the fight. That's what we're doing. Depending on which day of the week it is, they could think, or Nixon could think, that this is a viable policy. That in other words, we can take the troops out and the South Vietnamese actually can be effective in opposing the North. And part of what happens in the spring of 1971 with an operation called Lam Son 719, which is a much bigger deal than historians have recognized, is Lam Son 719. They have this huge plan. South Vietnamese are going into Laos. They're gonna cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which will prevent the North Vietnamese from, having another offensive. So this is kind of a big deal. This is going to be the first time that the South Vietnamese troops are going to fight without U.S. troops there, and it's a flop. It's a total failure. There's also an information part of the story, which is that suddenly Nixon and Kissinger can't get information that they actually want to have. They want the American planes to bomb the North Vietnamese troops, and the Air Force is saying there's bad weather. And suddenly Nixon and Kissinger, is the weather bad or is the weather good? We can't even find out. So they send Al Haig over there because he's the only person they really trust. But the point is that when all of that's done and all the details we could talk about, at the end of the day, what they've learned is the South Vietnamese army is not effective.
No matter how many B-52 bombing runs are made.
I don't think they go to just say, well, we're going to lose. I don't think it's like that. Yeah. But what they really focus on, what Nixon really focuses on, is we cannot count on the South Vietnamese army now. And so we have got to figure out a way to get our people out without South Vietnam falling to the enemy. That's our job from now till November
Yeah,
1970.
so we can wrap up on this and bring it back to the key point before when you asked, why didn't we appreciate what Nixon was doing more at the time, bringing the troops home, is because this was their plan to end the war so it didn't look like the United States was losing the war. They didn't want that on their record with re-election coming up. And even without a re-election, I don't think any American president wants to lose a war. So this plan, in my view, is more of a gamble. And the gamble was that the North Vietnamese could be convinced to give Nixon what he wanted if the United States just did enough violence, impress them with bombing. And this goes to the invasion of Cambodia. I'll just cite something you wrote here on page 155 of your book. You cite a national intelligence estimate that was routed through the CIA. I presume that Kissinger or somebody in a position of importance must have read this at some point. It said, one conclusion is that current developments in Cambodia will bring at least temporary advantage to the non-communist cause, but over the long run, the communists will probably cope with the degradation of their sanctuary by reorganizing their supply lines, relocating their bases, and adjusting their combat tactics. In the meantime, the estimate said, Cambodia will have suffered a debilitating internal struggle with large areas lost to communists and the seeds of eventual communist control spread widely across the country. So they create a new problem while trying to solve one problem, which is the sanctuaries. And then you write here, the report contained one other prediction that was in direct opposition to Nixon and Kissinger's expectations about the results of the invasion. It is unlikely that Hanoi will move toward early negotiations. So this gets to the fundamental critique of Nixon's first term, prolonging the war until they can set up a peace deal that looks good for that decent interval.
I keep coming back to this one point that they lie to themselves.
Kissinger liked to lie to Nixon, too. So you would have a conversation or a meeting with the North Vietnamese that went terribly. He didn't get anything out of them. Then he would call Nixon and say, oh, it went great.
Right. I mean, he would do that. It's never exactly clear, how much Nixon understood that Kissinger was lying. He did have access to the transcripts, although probably wasn't reading them, whatever. But, it's really almost in a way to think of it as kind of a gamble, which if you valued the lives of your own people or the lives of people in Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, we shouldn't do this. We're killing our own people. I mean, that is part of what's so incredible. I mean, the fact that not only are they oblivious to what is being done to Laotians and Cambodians and so forth, but even with their own people, and it gets worse. So, I mean, just one last example here that, to me was extraordinary. The Christmas bombing, which was very controversial at the time. You have to think of the Christmas bombing really as their last chance to do as much damage to North Vietnam as possible.
This is 1972.
This is 72, and Kissinger has to make a peace agreement, and they know they are. But this is your last shot to do damage, really. And what's interesting is that at that point, not only Melvin Laird, Secretary of Defense, but even Secretary of the Air Force and so forth, they're all saying don't do it. They're all saying that, and they're saying that because if American planes are flying over North Vietnam, a lot of planes are going to get shot down, that the North Vietnamese have improved their anti-aircraft capability. And so inevitably, as you're flying over Hanoi or wherever, planes are going to go down, pilots are going to be killed, pilots are going to be jailed, and so forth. And they don't care.
What we have to do, though, is to convince them that we are not easily pushed around. If we cave now, the agreement will be unenforceable, and we will have signed something that the government will make. Well, and remember, we're going to be around and outlive our enemies. And also, never forget, the press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The establishment is the enemy. The professors are the enemy. The professors are the enemy. Write that in the blackboard 100 times and never forget it.
I don't think you're going to ever hear Nixon and Kissinger saying, well, 3 of our planes got shot down yesterday, and we know we're going to make a peace agreement. Why are we doing this? They never say that. And that, in a way, is what's so extraordinary, is that even in terms of your own people, in the name of this game that you're playing, because it's really a game at this point, right? It's, get out and not look terrible.
And in the end, as we all know and as was expected at the time, the North Vietnamese stayed because they were Vietnamese. The U.S. pulled out of South Vietnam, and they did get their decent interval. I mean, human misery was the result of it all, but they did get their decent interval, and Nixon won re-election. Well, he also was covering up Watergate at the same time as well. So, I guess my final remark here, I just don't want to pick on Nixon and Kissinger. We also mentioned how LBJ was bombing Laos as well. We're using this case study to illustrate a larger point, the lawlessness of American foreign policy going back decades.
American leaders before Richard Nixon and after are not being constrained by international law, nor are they constrained even by American law, that they have operated often with impunity, and that as a consequence, literally millions of people have had their lives upended. And again, I bring it back to the reality of the Democratic Convention last night, which in many ways it was a good convention, and fighting Donald Trump is really important. And the fact that they were coming together, that we have a Black woman who is now a viable candidate, these are all great things. But in that reality of that convention, that floor, there's no awareness whatsoever of what the American role has been in other countries, preceding Richard Nixon and following Richard Nixon.
And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace. I have initiated a plan of action which will enable me to keep that pledge. The more support I can have from the American people, the sooner that pledge can be redeemed. For the more divided we are at home, the less likely the enemy is to negotiate at Paris. Let us be united for peace. Let us also be united against defeat. Because let us understand, North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, actually the next 2 episodes, we're taking the show on the road to George Washington's Mount Vernon. We're going to meet the new executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library on that beautiful property, Lindsay Chervinsky. That is next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.